they also have the gut that comes outside the body wall, you can see, which is resorbed in the adult, and the eyes are resorbed as they transform to normal eyes. And though you can't see it there, they have well-developed pectoral fins as well. Those are all developed well. That is my very favorite larva for all the years. Pressure sharks. Yes, they are in our waters in the warm months. They come right into the harbors. They are half-tailed. That upper lobe of the tail is as long as the fish itself. And it's razor sharp at the top and the bottom. Singly or in pairs, they circle schools of fish like herring or mackerel, tighten circles, and then they lash with their tail and injure fish. But that's not all they do. I've seen a video of them swimming under an individual fish, looking up at it, taking the tail, and whacking it right in the middle, breaking the back, feeding the fish, instantly eating it. Same shark swim along another fish underneath, whacks it with that tail and feeds it. So it doesn't just go after schools, it goes after individuals too. And it has very good, sorry, what do you call it? Eye-tail coordination. Can we have the next slide? Mary, this is for you. What is it? It's a pressure shark. Where is it from? It's from the back bed, from a herring weir. It got tangled in the herring weir, the water dropped, and it died. So they dragged it to the beach and gave us a call, said, "There goes Susie, died." So we went, measured, photographed it, and it was too big to bring back, but we did keep the tail and the head. Are they dangerous to us? No recorded attacks of any kind by pressure sharks, even though they are toothy and capable. This is a common shark in our waters, a poor beagle shark, and it's probably our most common large shark. It gets large, as you can tell by the maximum size, though usually is 2 meters or a little less, 3.5. Very toothy beast. As you can see.
Drum roll. Drum roll.
Now, capable predator.
Where did you come from?
This came from herring weir in Devon's Harbor. There were 2 of them. We had 2 heads. At the time, we didn't have tanks large enough to hold them. How we did. We did the heads.
How big was that one?
About my size. Yeah. Way more than that. Poor beagle shark. No recorded attacks on humans. They are known to have investigated divers, cameras, that kind of thing, but they shine it, they flash, right? What do these feed on? Herring, mackerel, shiny fish. So I'm not convinced that there's anything overt in those investigations by the shark.
So, invertebrates. Well, they comprise 95% of the animal kingdom, so I'm not going to show you all. I will show you some representative types, particularly some beasts that I know fairly well. I'll show those last, but I want to start off with something that you're probably all familiar with. A worm of some kind, known as clamworm or sandworm. These are probably the most typical type of what is known as paddleworm or bristleworms. So they do have these paddles on the side that they use to move around, and they have bristles on them. And this is actually the head of the beast with some tentacles and very sensory types of structures. These are pretty agile beasts that go after other worms. They actually have a very special apparatus known as a proboscis. So it's more or less the same beast. There's the head again, you see the eyes. But there's that proboscis. It's basically a muscular part of the digestive system that it can shoot out at its prey. And at the end, it's got these rather formidable jaws that it uses to hold on to the prey. It's literally in the blink of an eye that it does that. And that's how they make a living. That's sort of a typical polychaete. Now, let's look at some other polychaetes. This would include something like this, that you see up there. There's not much at all to this. And this actually is about as close to an earthworm as you will get, even though they are a totally different class. But basically segments, and there's not much else to this, because they live in tubes. So they make a very different kind of living. They don't have to move around, so they don't need those paddles to do that. Believe it or not, these are thousands of polychaete worms. And they have calcareous tubes. So this is like one animal right there. And they form these networks, colony of thousands of them together. And they live on hard substrates. In this case, it's actually a scallop shell. And the way they make a living is basically they live in high current environments. And they stick their tentacles out and wait for things to hit it. And then they withdraw it. A bit like a jellyfish that sits down at the bottom. And they can actually withdraw the fleshy part completely into the tube, and then they have, just like a snail, an operculum or a flap on top that it can close, so it can protect itself. So this is a very different kind of tube worm. Now, one that's even stranger, known as the quill worm. This looks like a quill, and it's a parchment-like tube. See that? You can actually see through with the animal inside. This is a deep sea polychaetes that you only find around 600 meters or so. The animal is actually right in there, and the tube is very different. We know almost nothing about this particular species. You do get them on trawls sometimes. But again, you know, these actually live in tubes. It's a very different way of making a living. Known as a grub worm. That's pretty much what it is. It's got these two calcareous plates. You can see some of those bristles still here. But, you know, it's just a tiny little grub. So who would have thought that this is actually a polychaete worm? This is what's known as a sea spider. One of the most unusual type of arthropods. They're not actually crustaceans, but they're related within the arthropods, where we also have the insects. They're all joint-legged animals. They're only very distantly related to land spiders, a totally different class. And you can see the clear segmentation. These are the legs. The head is actually this. The head is really just a proboscis, just like in that clam worm, except that we cannot extrude that proboscis. These animals are very slow moving. They live on hydroids, which are basically jellyfish that live on the bottom, or moss animals, and they're very well camouflaged. Of course, it doesn't even look like it's an animal. But they use this proboscis literally to suck the juices out of animals that they feed on. So it's a very specialized way of making a living. Now, the legs are rather short, as you can see, in this particular species. You actually have the pleasure of meeting the giant of sea spiders, which I have here. It's basically all legs. It's a deep water species, usually found around 1,000 meters or more, so these are rather rare. They're all legs, basically. See that? That huge tube up front, see that? That is the proboscis right in the center. So it has a proboscis that's even bigger than the rest of the body. And the legs itself are about 10 to 20 times as long. What's interesting is that this particular species, the sea spiders, have a very interesting digestive system that actually extends into the legs, which is very unusual. So we're talking about a centimeter. This is an adult. In another life, I used to work on these. My specialty was raising the babies from the eggs. Nobody else was crazy enough to try and do that. This is the one species that does not occur around here. These belong to what is known as the pea crabs. The closest ones you get from around here are in New England, and they do live inside oysters. These are not nearly as innocent looking as you might think. These crabs are facultative parasites. And this particular species lives on sand dollars in the Caribbean. And while it eats the majority of its food by just sitting in the food channel of the sand dollar is busy collecting all this food, and it just sits there and, this is good. At times, when the sand dollar has a hard time finding food, they are able to actually eat part of the sand dollar. They don't eat the whole sand dollar, but they can actually, literally, they have special claws that can tear off the tube feet the sand dollars have, just like sea stars, that soft tissue, but they actually also eat the spines. You've actually looked at the guts of these. This is another deep water crab. This is actually the head of it. The eyes are just on either side here. This is a juvenile. But I guess the important part is to realize the spines are bigger than its body. And compared to what we just saw, it's a very different type of animal. So what does the adult look like? Oh. This is what it looks like. So I'm not going to put that under. Actually, it might be the very same species, but at the pamphlet you have this red crab that was shown, that was given to you. Or you're supposed to rate on how well we did tonight. They are actually red when they are alive, bright crimson red. And the last part of the story is that these actually, believe it or not, are more closely related to hermit crabs. You all know hermit crabs, they live inside snail shells. So they are actually not true crabs as such. One of the ways we know that is by the number of legs. You've got one missing here, you still count 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the true crab. The reason for that is that the fifth leg is hidden underneath here. I won't go into that story, but evolutionarily speaking, these basically have become like crabs, but they are not true crabs. What is interesting about this beast is, and you might even actually be able to see that, that's the abdomen, but in the abdomen there's a hole. You can see that. In that hole, we found something. Not actually in the hole, but this is where it was attached at the hole. And that's this very creature right here. It was attached right here into the crab. Big sausage-like thing, a little bit too big to see entirely. What is that? I mean, it's basically just a fleshy type thing. And that organism, believe it or not, is related to this, which you probably will recognize as a barnacle. This happens to be a deep sea barnacle. And there's a juvenile, that's the adult. And there are the legs that they use to filter the water. How can this be a barnacle? Yes, it is a barnacle, but it's a parasitic barnacle. And they're actually, the reason we know that is when you raise the babies, which is the thing I was doing, they are the same. So evolutionarily speaking, we know that that's where they came from. But they obviously evolved into something quite different. What is interesting about the parasite, this is often a misconception, they do not kill the host, but what they do in this case, they functionally sterilize it, they castrate it. So this crab can no longer reproduce. So it's, in terms of genetics, it does have an effect on the population. The other thing it does, some of these crabs are fished commercially in other parts of the world, and it changes, actually, believe it or not, the taste of the meat. And, of course, they don't want to let the parasites propagate, so the recommendation is actually to take these out of the fishery. This is a big problem down in South America. So the parasite does have an effect, even though it doesn't actually kill it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Lou and I thank you very much for your attention and your patience.